There are about 9 ports around the world that are moving almost all of the global supply at scale. So you think how vulnerable that all is and how many nations are dependent on the success of that. And this is my point about how integrated the global supply is, almost this sort of great unseen network of things happening on which nations rely, and yet not always given enough credence by nations, or perhaps even the depth of understanding. So I think surfacing all that is really important, and so people understand what's going on.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders are doing and what they've learned along the way. My guest today is Ben Farrell MBE, Global Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, better known as CIPS. With over 70,000 members in 160 countries, CIPS is the world's largest professional body for procurement and supply professionals, playing a pivotal role in shaping resilient, ethical, and sustainable global supply chains. Ben, welcome to the Purposeful Strategist.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. I love the name of the podcast, by the way.
Oh, well, thank you for that.
I'm a bit of a strategy nerd. I was in the army for a long time. I spent a lot of time studying at it was known as the Staff College, at why strategies are successful and why strategies fail. So yeah, I'm very, very interested in strategies generally and organizations' success, what makes them successful and what makes them not so.
But just to get us started, maybe you could give us a picture of what it looks like today. You know, we know it's the largest procurement and supply institute, but what does that mean in terms of reach, member engagement, scope of what you do, number of staff, those sorts of things?
Yes. So we have what you might call the core team in the UK. We have a head office, and very excitingly, we're about to move to a new one, a sparkling new office just outside Peterborough. And we have about 230 members of staff there. And then we've got another 10 offices around the world. I say about another, sounds a bit vague as the chief executive. Well, the truth is at the beginning of this year, 2025, we had 5. And by the end of the year, we will have 10 because we are opening new offices to show up in more places in the world as a permanent presence. So that's the office structure. We have on top of that 97 branches of CIPS around the world, and the latest 2 additions to our branch network were Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. So 97, and I've been to many of them this year. Absolutely fantastic. Mostly volunteers around the world who are like-minded procurement professionals, ambitious to do better for the profession themselves, share knowledge, get together, talk about best practice, what's going on in the world, and have a thoroughly enjoyable time together. And on top of all of that, we have 110 tutors, direct associates, about 90 around the world. We work with quite a number of third parties like Harley Reid and other organizations, SCMPC in Malaysia. So if I started from a output and work backwards, CIPS is quite a big tapestry of thousands of people who are delivering the outcome, which is the remit to develop the art and science of procurement and supply around the world. So it's quite a big network consisting of different people playing lots of different parts in different ways around the world. I have to say it's taken me a few months to get my arms around great big jigsaw, but it's very, very interesting. And, you know, some parts of it, the some I'm really proud of, you know, there's a thing that we do call Health Procurement Africa, which is 3 teams across Kenya, Nigeria and Ethiopia, you know, building procurement capacity in these countries, you know, for people who can't afford it, had a real impact. In Nigeria, for example, the work there has provided drugs for lower costs at the point of need, and is actually, you can see the statistics, saving lives. It's improved infant mortality. So really good.
It sounds like, if for no other sign than the number of offices you're opening with a lot of change going on. What's the long-term ambition? Where you sort of see the organization getting to?
Yeah. The reason I was excited to take the job on, I was excited to see what it was to start with, looking at the organization. So there's a lot of potential in this. And it wasn't just because I feel, that the organisation to some extent had not done justice to itself for a few years. It was more about looking at what was going on in the world and thinking, if you lay it on to top of the globe, a great big net, and that would be about global supply and procurement these days, and it couldn't be more relevant. And that was played out this year, really, when you think about Trump and the tariffs and what's been going on in conflict around the world, and to some extent the weaponisation of supply chains, whether it was through conflict in the Middle East and the prospect of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, for example, or changing tectonic plates of China-US relationships in regard to trade. It's so of the moment. And then I thought about, the nature of the successful organizations today. And if you looked at even Temu and Alibaba and Apple and all these global supply chains, really is what they are, procuring product and getting them to every corner of the planet successfully. They're all actually led increasingly by people with a procurement supply chain background. So it seemed to me not only was the context of what was going on in the world so relevant, but also the requirement for the skills and the relevance of the skills to the future. And then I did a bit of work on the world in 2050 with some procurement and other futurists. And we talked about the growth of the population, the increasing urbanization, some countries like Nigeria, where it's estimated that 1 in 10 people on the planet will be born. Lots of factors coming together to think, the ability to supply and sustain communities at an effective cost will be such a skill in demand in future years. It seems such a brilliant time to be involved. So when I'm coming back in a rather long-winded way to answer your question about, what we want to do, what the long-term ambition is, given the role of CIPS, and I think the responsibility of the professional body, it's to do a number of things. The first of which is to act as an effective voice of the profession, offering a view on what's going on, talking confidently about highlighting the skills and relevance of the profession. And secondly, to continue to develop and grow that and be a thought leader in the space. I've been talking today about, AI and what more. AI is to some extent the sort of thing that people roll their eyes out now. We talk about it so much, but today I've been talking quite a lot about CIPS, which would be a large language model on procurement and licensing that for people. So we're thinking about how we create and continue to create a relevant machine that continues to develop the art and science of procurement and supply around the world. That's the job at hand. To do that, the third strand must be influence and reach, hence the new offices, the branches around the world, global conversation, because we're talking on these amazing laptops now that we take for granted, but they're all as a result of global supply, manufacturing, and all those sorts of things. So it's so in our DNA. And so my view was all of this is super relevant. CIPS was actually formed in 1932 on the back of the Smoot-Hawley Act that introduced steel tariffs, unbelievably. 100 years later, pretty much we're talking about the same stuff. But what's changed is the nature of global supply. It's so fundamental to the way the planet operates and national economies and sustainability. This is, I believe, a profession that is completely of the moment, and it's our responsibility to make people see that and to lead that.
I get what you're saying, and I think I'd agree with what you're saying. It really is of the moment. It does seem to me there's a really tricky bit of water to navigate, or a narrow path to tread, because it has, as you pointed to, supply chains have become very politicized. And yet I'm imagining CIPS somehow has to be neutral, can't itself end up on anybody's side in all that, sort of somehow has to be on everybody's side. How do you navigate that? How do you manage that internally and with your various stakeholders?
Yeah, it's not an issue that's been on my mind, because I think our role is to describe and articulate what's going on, to let others make the judgment on what's right. It seemed to me that when we were having a conversation early this year about automotive tariffs, let's just say, to shine a light on the reality that, for example, the Ford F-150, the most popular motor car in the United States, was 45% of parts came from out with the USA, to help understand why this is a complex question and maybe not the outcome that people thought if they just look at it from a unilateral national point of view. I think describing that helps people understand the context, not particularly taking a view left or right or whatever it is. It's saying, this is the nature of what's going on in the world today. And this is what we're seeing. We've got members in all those countries and we can get first-hand reports from everybody, which we often do. When I go onto the media, I tend to be more of a mouthpiece. I can say today I've spoken to, the Canadian members of CIPS. I've spoken to the Kenyans, to the team in Singapore, whoever it is, to offer a view to give some colour and context for others' decisions rather than thinking, it's our role to speak particularly about policy. But I think we can certainly help people shape that by giving good insight.
You talked about this sort of 2050.
Yeah.
How did that come about? Who got involved in it? How long did it take? Was it mostly internally driven? Was it more about mobilizing kind of points of view around the globe? How did you do that?
The origins of that particular piece of work, I became the chief executive in the autumn of last year, 7th of October. And because we have a graduation service ceremony in Dubai for the people who've been studying CIPS over there, and I was asked in my second week as the chief executive to go to Dubai and be part of the ceremony and award people their qualifications and credentials. So when I was there, I was in a hotel which was near the Museum of the Future. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it really is a fabulous, thought-provoking place. And I spoke with some of the team of the Dubai government. They were actually then said to me, have a look at this. This is our view of Dubai in 2070. And they showed me some extraordinary stuff about hyperloops and different ways of living and various different tunnels for people to move around, so people don't have to walk outside. And I started thinking much more about the future, because often in countries I've seen quite a long-term perspective. And in the UK, to some extent in recent years, perhaps it's the nature of the news agenda, the politics, we've had quite a short-term view. And it made me start to think slightly longer term. And so when I was thinking about the world that we might live in the future, I thought there's probably no point thinking 5 to 10 years out. Let's go further, see what lessons and things we can draw from that in order that we're in a position to articulate that well enough so people go, no, that's actually a choice. What I suppose we were trying to lay out is to say we could choose to live in a certain way if we achieve certain things, as opposed to rather short-term thinking, actually, the levers we've got to pull are not going to get the outcomes quickly enough to change the world that we want to live in. And if I gave you one really good example, I was excited to learn this. So I went to the Museum of the Future and I discovered this thing called Lunergy, which is about harvesting energy from space, in space, with vast solar panels by the moon, and then microwaving the energy back to Earth. The idea is that there's sufficient energy harvested in space to power the Earth without having any generation of power on the planet Earth. And that will be possible by 2070. So I thought, do you know what? We should start moving the debate out further and actually thinking, what is it that in sort of science, technology in the future that could enable us to think about the world that we want to live in, as opposed to the track we're on, unless we do things about it. So I started thinking much more in terms about how we might make the future and create the future. That's why I got to 2050 thinking, well, if I go too far out, people will think, well, that's just inconceivably far away. But if we're 10 years out, they think, well, do you know what, I'm not so sure. So I thought that 2050 was a reasonable landing pad to end up on and has been really helpful as a reference point.
So I can see the value in that. I'm kind of curious, how does one take on such a long-term view? How do you get to something useful out of that? What voices did you have to call on? Was it a series of big kind of group workshops, or was it you with a few experts in a room by yourself?
Well, it's in no sense finished, and I'm not sure you'll ever get to a point where it is finished. But I often talk about it as I travel to different countries, and you hear different people's perspective on that. So I was in Nigeria talking to the government of Nigeria saying, 1 in 10 people born on the planet here by 2050. And of course, they're looking at me, not surprised, but interested. And we then started talking about procurement in Nigeria and the need for inward investment, the need to tackle corruption as a result. So it sort of stimulates. It's a really good way of stimulating thought and engagement in a non-controversial way, because nobody thinks it is certain in any way, but it's a reasonable point of view. And they go, well, that's so interesting. How do we avoid the problems that we have the prospect of finding ourselves dealing with? So people start thinking of it. And so we're doing lots of work, for example, in Nigeria about, national procurement strategy there and helping there. And I've had that same experience in lots of other countries, actually, where, it's very, very thought provoking that actually, if you want to create a successful nation, I think you need to take a bit of a longer term view. And it's very, very difficult to do that at the moment. Yeah.
One of the things I think I got from what you're saying, as you're talking about how you're using it, even if it's not written this way, it sounds like it's a set of questions. Sort of we might end up here. Is that where we want to be? If that's where we want to be, how do we get there? If that's not where we want to be, how do we avoid that? It almost sounds like it's in use, not a statement, almost more a question.
In my mind, it's a series of unanswered questions with the prospect of that generating a response. Can I just give you a really good worked example of this on my mind right now? In the United Kingdom, we spend about 1/3 of all the tax collected every year on the procurement of goods and services to run the country. And that's going up at about 7% a year and has done for the last few years. And I think, you've seen the rate of tax has gone up. And it's not unreasonable nor dramatic to say that we have probably reached the upper end of the tolerance in terms of how much tax people are prepared to pay, or the government thinks is practical to take off people. And therefore, without some way of thinking differently about this, where does it take us? Everybody wants to sustain the level of service in the welfare state, schools, education. We want strong defence. We've seen that in debates recently. So where's the money coming from? So those sorts of questions, they roll the clock forward to 2050 and say, well, do you know what? Medical advances, just as some extraordinary advances in prosthetics and all sorts of things, will mean the population has grown, the demand for medical care is going to increase. So where's that money coming from? That drives a recognition of thinking differently. And we're not just talking about some minor interventions. You say, well, what is it that technology might be able to do us? So out of those conversations, I think we get to a strategy where it's saying, do you know what? There's got to be some leadership questions around that. Let's just take the UK, a question of structural government structure. I think technology, often I see the difference across the world between the preparedness of governments to invest in technology because it's so expensive, AI, for example, versus the private sector driving business from it. But the trouble with that, the gap between the two widens. And there is therefore a question of saying, let's get a strategy together that requires, recognition that this is not a short-term fix. We need to do some big, bold adjustments in order to get ourselves to that world that we want to live in, as opposed to the one that will get delivered to us unless we do these things.
That's a very exciting idea. I'm sure a really interesting conversation. But I wonder if we could take it back to CIPS for a minute. How does all that then play back into what CIPS is doing over the next few years?
Yeah.
Was some of that what led you to decide to go from 5 to 10 offices? What are the practical implications of all of that?
The practical implications are, I think, if we stripped it all back to the nuts and bolts, maybe it was a sort of military point of view, thinking this is not a discretionary thing. You're given a task to do as the voice of the profession. I feel it's our responsibility. So we need to be in India, 1.4 billion people with a booming industrial base, manufacturing, exporting. They need to have global standards of procurement and supply in order that they can thrive as an economy and the population can thrive. So we're opening an office there. Same in Nigeria, the economic powerhouse in Africa, really, when you think 230 million people and the Nigerian government wants to create what they call the Dubai of Africa. We've got a part to play, and equally in East Africa and many other nations, we've got a part to play in creating that prosperity and thriving economic environment for organizations to prosper by developing skills, competencies at an individual level with people, but also organizational level. We're doing lots, for example, across organizations in developing, countries I sometimes think we rudely call developing nations. If I looked at Saudi Arabia, categorized as a developing nation formally, when I look at it, I go, wow, that is, developing. But to be honest, it's going to develop so profoundly quickly ahead of us. I think it's a bit of a misnomer to call it a developing nation. So, but my point was, we help organizations. We've been doing so much at an organizational level and an individual level, going in and understanding, skills gaps and ethical standards, just bringing the capacity and capability of procurement and supply professionals up to another level to optimize their effectiveness within a business context as a team as well as individuals.
Given that, how do you define success? I mean, obviously beyond the traditional metrics like member growth or revenue, which professional bodies always have to keep an eye on. But from what you're saying, I don't hear that as that's our number one objective.
I honestly believe that those things are a consequence of doing what we do well. So the numbers will follow as we produce value and quality in what we're doing. So we are building capacity and understanding in such an effective way that people recognize this. And I also think there's a bit that says, if you're spending a level of money, typically in many nations, most nations, there's about a third of taxpayers' money is spent by the government on procurement of goods and services, very generally. When you think about that level of spend, you think, well, we want to make sure this is spent in the most effective, professional, competent and earnest way so that people feel there's great value for money in it. So that's all important to us. So it's all about making the profession the very best possible place to thrive and contribute to the success of, public and private sector. And then I think the numbers and the revenue, it follows. And I think the last few months have begun to show that that is in fact the case.
You've mentioned a couple places in Africa. If you're going to talk about procurement supply, you've sort of got to end up talking about China. So how are you thinking about that?
Yes, this is very interesting. So I did some work. I worked at John Lewis and Waitrose prior to getting this amazing job with CIPS. And we were looking at, UK dependency on China, particularly in general merchandising, actually. And it will not surprise you or anyone else listening. The proportion of product manufactured in China is extraordinary, vast percentage of UK imports. So we thought, well, imagine a world where this is a hypothetical scenario. There's some sort of Chinese intervention towards Taiwan, diplomatic, political sanctions, which would mean that we couldn't work in the same way with China. We would then displace the manufacturing to other parts of the world. Let's just say to Turkey, for example, which has, the capability to do some of the stuff. And of course we say, well, that looks all quite feasible, but of course then you talk with the Turkish in detail and all the raw materials come from China.
Yeah. Yeah.
So do you know what I mean? The reality is, when I talked about the global supply and this vast network, and nations acting unilaterally will find themselves isolated rather than effectively sort of shoring up their own economies, because this is the world we're in today. I was in Saudi. I met the chief executive of the housing real estate development company. They're building 80,000 houses a year. I was talking about the materials. A lot of them are coming from China, but actually the Chinese have moved their manufacturing to Saudi. The cost of electricity there was, I think, 4 cents per kilowatt, about 40 cents in the UK. So the ability for nations like China to manufacture at scale and cost effectively, this has changed the landscape so much. So these are profoundly important questions. And I think the reality of the world today, and has been for some time, is we're very, very dependent on China.
Is that one of your current offices or one of the ones you're planning on opening?
We have not got a plan at the moment to open an office in China, but I think in due course it will be sensible to be able to help create more capacity over there. We have a third party who we've worked with for some time over there. We have a number of people who do our CIPS exams, thousands of people every year doing different exams over in China. We have our products translated into Mandarin as well. So yeah, we have a presence. I think what's so brilliant about my job is I can see the dots. I can join the dots together. I can see what's going on in the world. When I see how tightly wound the global supply world is, one disruption. So I was in the port of Singapore, amazing AI enabled world. And, each crane is moving 2 containers an hour. And if that's disrupted, somewhere in the world doesn't get its supply. And it's really, really tightly wound. And in Lagos, the port there is doing extraordinary things similar. There are about 9 ports around the world that are moving almost all of the global supply at scale. So you think how vulnerable that all is and how many nations are dependent on the success of that. And this is my point about how integrated the global supply is, almost this sort of great unseen network of things happening on which nations rely, and yet not always given enough credence by nations, or perhaps even the depth of understanding. So I think surfacing all that is really important, so people understand what's going on.
One other thing I'd be interested in getting your thoughts on, you've been around for 100 years or thereabouts. You're a chartered institute. It all sounds in some ways very traditional. How do you balance that tradition with also driving innovation?
You know what? We're moving our office now, and CIPS has got all sorts of very largely ethical commitments within it that hold true to this day. But meanwhile, the world that we live in has changed, and we've had to respond to that over time. And as I said, I slightly, joined an organisation that had been dormant for a while, or had been sort of ready to move to evolve. I call it the evolution for the next stage, rather better than dormant. So the evolution, I keep saying we're going to wake the sleeping giant, which we're busy doing at the moment.
Right.
And part of that is getting this restless paranoia about, never being quite good enough, and waking up in the morning the next day saying, yesterday was not going to be good enough for today, and continuing to have that mindset and thinking about thought leadership. So I'm encouraging everybody to be more extrovert, more connected around the world, learning quickly from different parts of the world, bringing that together, and then thinking about the next evolution, because clearly as an organisation, we need to grasp and think how that's going to help us. But more importantly, probably about the thought leadership for the profession. And a lot of my time I'm thinking about what we might describe as the job description of the chief procurement officer or the chief supply chain officer that we look at now. But, I was talking about 2050, but I've agreed with a futurist that we will write a job description for 2050 and what that would look like. So we might be able to think, very originally of bringing all the different bits together to reimagine the job. Because when you think about supply, procurement, the ethical, the sustainable considerations, at the moment in most organizations, they seem to have a separate ESG team. And it seems to me entirely odd to do that when actually it's everybody's, responsibility. You can't have it as a specialist sport to one side. It needs to be in the DNA of the organization. So when you start to bring it all together and you think about circularity and you think about the efficiency driven into that. So I was thinking about the future of the type of job will help. So I'm with you in that being one of the central challenges of a professional body, and always having that sort of healthy paranoia of thinking, how are we evolving? Are we offering value to our members, to our profession, about thinking innovatively enough about the future?
Could I bring up one other sort of sometimes difficult challenge that associations, membership bodies, trade bodies, whatever, often have, which is a very sort of siloed view of the world internally. You have membership people who worry about membership. You have policy people who worry about policy. Is that something you've been noticing and wanting to do something about? Or is it sort of somehow you've found the magic formula and it's just not an issue?
I think you have to be relentless in your pursuit of excellent communication across the organisation. We've got a new way of thinking about our member base in segmented terms, a lot from my retail experience, and using lots of functions in teams together rather than having functional tasks, having team tasks to remedy that exact point. And also, I don't think you can communicate enough. I really don't. And sharing knowledge, shared consciousness is the key to this. Something I learned through my military experience. That will define the success of your organisation. And if you find in the silos no one really knows what's going on the left and right of them, it's a recipe for going extremely slowly and being ineffective and having an incoherent voice as well. So we're working on it. I'm not saying we've cracked the nut yet, but it's something that we all recognise we have the opportunity to really change. Working from home and the way we have hybrid working as well, I actually think you need to try doubly or triply hard to avoid that, because it's so much more transactional. and people don't build the relationships. I think there's a downside with remote working that you can see when you're at a sort of operating at an organizational level. If you're a member of a team, it's probably less obvious, but if you're the CEO, you can see it. So I've got to work doubly hard to make sure that the passage of information across the organization is effective. And when that's international as well, you've got to work out ways of working that are around the clock, follow the sun and try to speak in language which is relevant to the globe rather than, saying, well, what time are we meeting? It's so tempting to say we'll meet at 9:30. Well, that's 12:30 in Dubai and you're meeting people there. And, all those sorts of things matter, I think. I think one of the things that's been quite striking is getting people to know one another in an informal sense, building relationships, familiarity with someone, enabling them to work well with one another in different parts of the organization. So sometimes we look, vertically across the organization. I'm looking much more horizontally now at groups of people working together.
Very interesting. I suppose one last question, which is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know about CIPS, about procurement and supply, about yourself that we haven't gotten to?
I'm excited about what CIPS is doing. I keep saying the stars have aligned for the profession, and I really believe that in terms of, where I open the conversation about what's going on in the world today. It's an exciting time. I want us to do more for shining a light on the profession, because wherever I go in the world, honestly, I've met people who love their job. And it's been so interesting and motivating to share that with lots of other people. But to some extent, I always feel bad that we haven't done a good enough job for people who are thinking about a career. Where should I go? What am I interested in? Might I go into procurement supply? And I don't think we've done well enough in recent years or ever perhaps to say, this is a really interesting and super relevant profession. You should get involved, because I meet people who love their work. They're very, very happy doing it. And this sounds like a painful plug, but in a way, we just had the CIPS salary survey. And if you're CIPS qualified, you get 52% more pay than if you're not. So it offers an increasingly lucrative profession as well. But that's not really the point of it. The genuine, sincere point is that we need to try harder, which we will be doing, on helping people understand that there's a great career to be had in this ever more relevant profession. And some of the leaders you can see, like Tim Cook at Apple and Mary Barrett, General Motors, are leading the organizations. And I am convinced we're going to see so much more of that in the future. This is the place to be. This is where the action is.
What a great message to end on. And as a father of at least one more child who's kind of beginning to think about what am I going to do for a living, that's a great message to hear. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for that.
Total pleasure. Nice to have the opportunity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.